We're going to start. Okay. Hi, my name is Elika Etemad, and I'm otherwise known as Fantasy. I work on CSS standards at the W3C. This is my first time giving a talk at a conference like this. I wanted to get a sense of like, who are you? How many people here work with CSS? Hey, how many people know what it is but don't really work with it much? Who has no idea what CSS is? Okay, good. And how many people here know what W3C does? How many people don't know what they do? Okay. So I'm going to talk about CSS and the history of CSS and layout and why things are hard and stuff like that. And we'll get into that. But we have to travel back in time. So we're going to go back a long time ago into the dark ages of the mid-1990s when web pages looked kind of like this. Okay, they weren't really all that bad. Some of them were and some of them weren't. But this was before CSS. And this was when HTML was used both for your markup and for your styling. So you used things like the font tag, and H1 meant I want a big font. It didn't mean heading, it just meant big font. Block quote meant I want indentation. Everybody centered everything. No, not really, but if you wanted to put a background on an element, you had to use a table because you couldn't put that attribute on just any other element. So, and the most advanced layout technique we had was tables with spacer GIFs. These were transparent images that you would size to like take up space because we didn't have padding or margins or anything like that. So when CSS1 came out, what it was designed to do was really to replace all of this with a style sheet language. And so it had kind of like an analog to everything that was in HTML. You had backgrounds and borders you could put on any element, or fonts. You could change the list styling, and you can tweak alignment and white space with CSS. And you could change the entire look of your website, not just one page, but your entire website by tweaking one line in one file. And this was completely revolutionary. It was totally new and amazing. So CSS1 didn't have a lot of layout stuff in it. It had width and height properties, which were basically the same thing that they were in HTML tables and image tags. And it had floats and clearance, which were the align attribute on image, and on tables would allow you to float something and the text would wrap around. This wasn't designed for doing layout stuff. This was actually for floats where you would want the text to wrap around, and that's what people used it for. And the way you did layout was actually you would just keep using table tags. That was still the state of the art, but now you didn't have to use spacer GIFs, you could use margins and padding. And that was, CSS1 was starting to catch on in the late 1990s, and this was when the CSS Working Group started working on CSS Level 2. CSS Level 2 brought the state-of-the-art layout tool to CSS. You could do tables in CSS with the display property. This made 2-column layouts a simple one-liner in CSS. That would make 2 equal height columns. It was supported in Gecko, WebKit, and Opera, but it wasn't supported in Internet Explorer until version 8. So for many, many, many years, this did not work. And so web designers couldn't use it. Like, you couldn't use that, especially when Internet Explorer had like over 90% of the market share. So while designers were taking heed of the advice to separate your content from your styling and don't use tables for layout, but they couldn't use CSS tables, so they started to hack out things with floats and absolute positioning and the clear fixes and all this kind of stuff. And that's really where we're at today. Most layout systems in CSS are hacking together a two-dimensional layout design using a bunch of stuff that really wasn't designed to do that. And that's why it's hard, and that's why it's tricky, and that's why it's fragile and annoying and hard to learn. So, to a large part. There's also, I would say, yeah. The one limitation of the CSS tables is that it doesn't let you reorder your columns, which you can do with some of the CSS layout techniques in use today. But everybody was like, why is equal height column so hard in CSS, blah, blah, and they were all complaining, well, it works fine in the standard. Like, you just can't use it on the web. So anyways, so while this was going on, this is kind of what the CSS, this is the, we have the browser wars 1, which was Netscape versus Microsoft, and that's when CSS was catching on. And then Microsoft won, and we had the IE6 monopoly for like a long time. And what was going on as the web design community was struggling with how to create layouts using floats and abspas was the CSS Working Group was working on CSS 2.1. We had started on CSS Level 3, where we wanted to add like cool new like great layout stuff amongst other things. But in the early 2000s, we realized that there was a bigger problem to solve here, and that was interoperability. If you loaded your web page in a browser, it didn't really look the same in the next browser you loaded. There was a lot of inconsistencies in the rendering. And part of this was because the CSS 2.0 standard had so many ambiguities and errors and conflicts, and it just was not clear what exactly you're supposed to do in all the cases. And there weren't a lot of tests for standards compliance, and the browsers, as a result, had a lot of bugs and a lot of inconsistencies. So we set aside our glamorous work on shiny new features and dug into things like calculating widths and heights of block elements. And that lasted for a very long time. If you look, I think Eric Meyer has a timeline of CSS publications, and there's like this dip in the mid-2000s where we didn't publish very much except updates to 2.1. And so we had our quest for interoperability was pretty much what we were doing. And then in the late 2000s, that started to wrap up. We had things like ACID 2. We had people advocating really for browsers to fix their bugs. The browser developers were really working on that. And towards the end of that decade, we were starting to get to a point where browsers had consistent output for your HTML file that used CSS2. And that meant you could build more reliable websites and spend less time hacking around bugs. And as that was winding down, the CSS Working Group and the browser vendors started revving up. Let's start implementing some of the new cool CSS3 stuff. And so that gets us to today, where we have Browser Wars 3, the mobile edition. So CSS3 is, unlike CSS1 and CSS Level 2, CSS3 is not this like one long monolithic thing where you have to implement everything. We found that 2.1 was already way too long and unwieldy to handle as a spec, so we split it up into modules. And this way, each piece can evolve and develop and go through the process at its own pace, and they can level up at their own pace. So we have, for example, Selectors Level 4 has already been drafted because Selectors Level 3 has been done for a while. But we still don't have a draft of CSS Tables Level 3, partly because nobody wanted to look at table layout algorithms. They're really scary. So Level 3 is kind of, you can group most of the modules into about 4 major categories. The first one is about processing power. Things like selectors, things like media queries, variables will fall into that category. Things that make it easier to assign properties to where you want them. The next category of stuff is decoration. Border radius, background, multiple backgrounds, gradients, things like that add decoration to your page, but don't actually really impact the layout much. The third category is typography and internationalization. Things like vertical text, line breaking and justification controls, hyphenation, downloadable fonts, being able to turn on and off font features in your OpenType fonts. things like that. And then the last category, and the hardest, is layout. It's a little hard to understand exactly how difficult layout is to standardize, because if you don't really work on layout engines, because what you want is pretty obvious. I want that, like it's, I want this to fit around the text, and I want this to balance out this way, and like I can describe it to you pretty simply, and you know that this is right or it's not. But all of the algorithms that go into that are pretty complicated and very detailed, and we have to get down all of the details. You can't have the spec fall out of the algorithm that the programmer decided to use for that particular product, because it all has to be standardized. So we have to define exactly how it works. We have to define how it interacts with all the other pieces of CSS. Things like margin collapsing, floats, clearance, auto-sizing of tables, vertical text when you auto-size them in a table and you mixed vertical text with horizontal text, like it all gets pretty hairy. So layout is hard and it takes a while, and so we're kind of getting to it towards the end of, we were doing all those first, and now we're getting to the hard part, which is layout. So before we really talk about layout, I wanted to talk about layout for the web and how that's different from print, and like what do we really want for layout for the web? Because what we want isn't what we have right now. It's pretty bad what we have right now. So let's talk about web versus print. And I'm going to get my notes because I don't remember all this. So in print media, you know the size of the page. You know the amount of content that you have. In some cases, you can even tweak the content to fit the page, though not always, but you can sometimes. You know what fonts you have. You know they're going to come out right. You know exactly what the kerning's going to be. You know the size of the text. And if you ask the computer to do some layout for you, like run the hyphenation algorithm or whatever, and if it doesn't come out quite right, you can tweak it later. And then when you're done tweaking it, then you send it to the printer. And pretty much what you send to the printer is what everybody gets in their hand and looks at. In print, the designer is pretty much in control of the input and the output of the layout process. But this isn't true on the web, because on the web, when you send your page to a viewer, they may or may not have the right fonts installed. They might have a different sized screen. They might have different screen resolutions. Their screen is a different aspect ratio from yours. People resize their windows. They make them narrower or wider than you thought they would be. They zoom the text size because they can't see very well, not like all the young designers with their tiny fonts, and the old people are like, I can't see this text. So they zoom their fonts, and then that changes the size of the text. And then you have user-generated content and stuff you spit out from databases, and so you don't even control the content in a lot of cases. And so you have a bunch of content that you don't control, but you still, and you don't control the output parameters, but you still have to style this somehow. And the result has to be right, because you can't tweak it after it shows up on their screen, right? You're not sitting there and tweaking the layout on like grandpa's, old CRT. So you could send a PDF, and then the people would get exactly what you designed, but nobody wants that, because the web content, by and large, does adapt to people's screens, and people want that. They want it to fit their screen. They want it to use font size they can read, and they want to read the content that they wrote. So we come to a few key differences between the web and print. On the web layout system has to be flexible, it has to be adaptable, and it has to be automatic. And it has to be robust. It can't just fail because you loaded it into an environment that the designer wasn't expecting to have his page loaded into. Because that happens all the time, especially on my computer. Like, it's a small computer, and I put windows side by side, which makes them even narrower. So like, a lot of pages don't really work for me. Okay, so let's talk about CSS3 Layout. CSS3 Layout is the first time that the CSS Working Group is really focusing on creating a layout system. And we want to do this right, and we want to do it in a way that works for the web. So there's some things that we want out of a layout system we don't currently have out of layout systems in CSS, and that aren't common in print layout systems. So we can't just like copy what they're doing. First off, CSS layout has to be flexible. It has to adapt to different screen sizes and to different font sizes, and it has to do so gracefully and continuously and in a way that makes sense and is predictable, but also like gives you good results. It needs to be powerful because we want to be able to express all of the designs that the designers want in this system. And we want also, but not just the result that they want in one size, but we also want to express the constraints that they want it to flex under. If I resize the screen, where does the extra space go? How is it distributed? These are things that you don't really consider so much for print, but you do have to do it for the web. And we want to make the simple things easy and the hard things possible. We want a system that's robust, that doesn't break down and start clipping content, and like you don't want when the sizes aren't quite what we expected. If the screen is too narrow, you should still be able to see all the content. It might not look the bestest, but it should be visible and readable. And we want a system that's understandable. The current ways of doing layout in CSS aren't very understandable. They're hard to learn. They don't make a whole lot of sense. And so when we're intentionally designing a system that is designed to do layout, we want to make sure that the syntax is clear and straightforward and easy to understand, and that the concepts and the algorithms that we're using to do layout make sense to the designers and really express how they want the layout to behave. And the last thing is it has to be performant. And this one's a bit tricky. The web is a platform for dynamic interactive applications, and people expect things to be fast. They don't want to sit there and wait for the computer to calculate the optimal layout. So there are some layouts that people really want, but that you have to solve them like in an iterative constraint solver. Otherwise, like, you don't get the right answer. But we want to minimize that. We want to try and, the cases that don't need that kind of that kind of an algorithm to be able to optimize that so that it can be laid out, the page can lay out fast. It can respond to DOM changes. It can respond to whatever manipulation that the author is doing on the page, and it also so it shows up, loads fast. So, okay, so far we only really have all of this for like one-dimensional layout on the web for things like, well, CSS specifications, long documents that have one consistent flow that don't have this kind of two-dimensional interaction among things. But we have it for one-dimensional layout. We want to get it for two-dimensional layout. So these are some of the modules that are in the process of being standardized at the W3C. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them. The first one is MultiColumn Layout. It doesn't really do a whole lot to solve the two-dimensional layout problem, but it does show some of the principles that we were just talking about. It's very simple to use. If you want some columns, you can say the column width that you want, and then CSS will look at that column width and say, well, how many columns of this width can I fit in the page, and then put that many columns on the page. So if there's 5 columns that'll fit, they'll put 5 columns, and if there's only 2 columns that'll fit, they'll only put 2 columns. And if there's, you can also specify the maximum number of columns. Say, I only want, 4 columns, but if you can't fit 4 columns, then, less is okay, but don't put more. And then the width isn't an absolute. You're not guaranteed to get 30 columns. Because if 2.5 columns fit, then you'll get 2 columns that are 45 Ms wide each. Or if half a column fits, you're not going to get a column that overflows the width of the screen. You'll just get a narrower column. So the width might not always be what's specified, but for the reader, the person who's looking at your page, it looks like it fits their screen perfectly, and that's what we really want. The main problem with multi-column layout is that it on scrolled media, if you have too much content, you have to kind of like scroll down and then scroll back up and then scroll down again. And that doesn't work really well. It's a problem we need to solve. But for short content and for printed matter, it works pretty good. The next module I wanted to talk about is FlexBox Layout. This module is still being worked out, but it's stabilizing, and I think we'll probably have it done by the end of the year. FlexBox introduces the concepts of flexible sizes. You can specify size of an element as a proportion of its container. So it's really handy for toolbars, for example. In this one, we said that the first 3 boxes are all equal proportion, and the fourth box is twice as wide as the other boxes. And then the algorithm adds up all the numbers and then assigns the proportions accordingly. You can also specify proportions in a relative manner, where, for example, you can say, I want you to lay out all the content using like the content size as the size of the box, and then take the extra space and distribute that extra space across. So in the first case, you'll get like the first 3 boxes are each the same width exactly. And in the second case, they're all different widths, but they each have the exact same amount of extra padding. So depending on what you're trying to do, you might want to use one or the other. FlexBox Layout was originally designed for use in Mozilla's user interface. Mozilla's UI is all built with XML and JavaScript and CSS. And so all of the kinds of toolbar layouts and whatever that's available in Mozilla's UI that they're using, that will soon be available for the web. And that's FlexBox. The next module I want to talk about is Grid Template Layout. This is a module that's created by putting together 2 proposals, Bert Boss's template layout proposal, which you might have heard of, and a grid layout proposal that came from Microsoft. We're still in the process of like putting them together and figuring out exactly how everything works, but it's pretty promising, and that should make 2-dimensional layout grids a thing in CSS that's easy and straightforward and obvious for it to use. The way it works is that you'll declare an element to be a grid using the display property, and then you give it some widths for their grid rows and heights for the grid, widths for the grid columns and heights for the grid rows. And you might, optionally, you might give it a grid template where you're assigning, like, you're making a little ASCII art diagram of your page, and each letter represents a slot that you can refer to by its letter. Once you have a grid, you can assign things into it. You can assign them by their letter name, or you can assign them by using row and column indexes. So we're still working on the exact syntax from this, so don't copy-paste from my slides. It's not going to work. But you might start to see experimental implementations of this pretty soon. And if you have feedback on use cases you want to make sure are solved, or you have suggestions for better ways of handling it, go to the spec and send some comments, because we're listening. The next set of modules I wanted to talk about a bit are regions and exclusions. These are 2 proposals from Adobe for doing magazine-style layouts, kind of the stuff that you can already do in InDesign. I wanted to show these, not because they're really cool, which they are, but also because in their current state of the proposals, they're not really very suitable for the web. So regions allows chaining boxes into a common flow, kind of like the way the columns in a multi-column element are chained together. Except they don't have to be all the same width. They don't have to be all, in a row. They could be anything, and you can style them. Exclusions allows for non-rectangular containers and non-rectangular floats. But let's talk about some of the problems here. To take a concrete example, exclusions and shapes lets you fill a circle with text, like that. But if you increase the font size, then all the text doesn't fit anymore. So what happens? We don't have a solution for that currently. The proposals right now, they handle this by saying, oh, you use JavaScript, and you figure out that, oh, stuff overflowed, and then you change the layout. Then arguably that works, but it's not really what we're committed to for layout and CSS. To take another example, if you want to put a circular float exactly in the middle of an element, whose size depends on its content, the position of that circle depends on how it impacts the content around it, which impacts the height of the element, which impacts the position. So you get this kind of circular dependency, and you can either solve that problem fast, or you can solve it correctly, but you can't really do both. So those are some of the things that the CSS Working Group is struggling with, and why these things aren't making very fast progress through the standards process, because we want to solve these problems and get it right for the web. Mozilla and Opera, at least, are not happy with implementing things as they stand, and so it might take a little while until we actually get these kinds of layouts expressible in a way that makes sense for the web. Last thing I wanted to talk about is media queries. Hang on. Now I need to, there we go. So this is a design that Divya Manyan and Jason Crancer created for the CSS Working Group. It's a very flexible page that adapts to different sizes. Here on a very narrow screen, you can see like it would work for, it folds into one single column. And on a wide screen, it's got a 3-column design with the news sidebar on the side and then the different sections organized into 2 columns of area. Then we have this table of contents here next to the expression of like what is CSS. And as you make the screen narrower, the layout folds. Now it's dropped to 2 columns here, but we still have, this still looks the way it does. If you keep making it narrower, then eventually this gets too narrow over here at the top, and that drops down so that we have what is CSS at the top, followed by the little short table of contents thing. But we still have enough room for 2 columns for the news, so we keep that. But as you get really narrower, then it drops to 1 column. So this works on like very well on a variety of sizes of pages. So there's no JavaScript involved here. It's all just CSS. And the point is that while CSS layout systems can and should adapt to changes in the input and in the output, there's a limit, there's thresholds at which your layout needs to dramatically change in order to actually really work for that output environment. And media queries allows you to do this. It lets you take multiple designs and conditionally combine them into a single page. So together with everything else that's coming up, you could probably do some really cool stuff. And that's an overview of what's coming and what we're working on and why it's not here yet. So let's move on to how things go from idea to implementation at W3C. So the W3C process has basically 3 major phases for a spec. There's the design phase, which is the working draft phase, and then there's the testing phase, which is candidate recommendation, and then there's recommendation, which means it's done, it's a standard, that's it. In the CSS Working Group, we kind of breaking it down a little bit more to give people a better idea of what's really going on. In the early stages of creating a module, you're in the exploring stage. This is kind of a brainstorming stage. The spec will change a lot. It's really in flux as we try to figure out exactly how things should work. And that corresponds to like an early working draft. Then we have a revising stage where we know the scope of what we're working on and roughly how it should work, but we still kind of need to figure out, like, make it a little bit more concrete and more stabilized and deal with some of the design feedback. And then there's a refining stage where we work out all the details. And then at that point, once we think we've got all of the stuff ready and nobody else has raised any problems with it, we'll take it to last call, address any last comments anyone has, and take it to CR. And in the testing phase, that's when we're testing the spec. In order to test the spec, you have to test implementations. But really what we're trying to do is test that the spec is detailed enough and that whatever's in it is implementable. So we write test suites, we try to get implementations, and it's once you have a test suite and 2 implementations that pass those, 2 independent implementations made by different teams developing different layout engines, then we know that the spec is good, it's got enough detail, it's implementable on multiple architectures, and that's when the spec gets finalized and goes to CR, or rec. So ideas in the CSS Working Group come from a lot of places. There's actually been some argument about oh, new features should come from designers because they know what they want, or new features should come from implementers because they know how to implement them. Or new features should come from the CSS experts because they know what they're talking about. Actually, nobody makes that argument because it's not controversial enough. But actually, in the CSS Working Group, new ideas come from everywhere. If we look at just backgrounds and borders, Mozilla implemented rounded corners and then proposed it to the working group. Image borders was posted as a suggestion onto the www style list by a designer, and from there, got worked out and became what it is today. And multiple backgrounds was a case where we saw people using multiple divs to get multiple backgrounds around what was really one box, and said, we got to solve this problem in a way that's better. And we got multiple backgrounds into the spec, and then the implementations followed. If you look at a module level, transitions, animations, and transforms came from Apple. They implemented it, and then they proposed it to the working group. But selectors, multi-column layout, and media queries, and CSS3 color, which does RGBA and opacity, those were all spec'd out first, and the implementations came much, much later. But most of our specs are really a total mashup, where somebody proposed something, somebody implemented, it said feedback, and then it just cycles through. Most of the work in the standards process isn't about drafting the initial proposal. It's really more about the review cycles. It's about getting feedback from people from different environments, from different development teams, from web designers, from people who really spend their time with the spec and can notice beforehand, oh, this feature interacts really poorly with that, you need to fix that, before you actually go and try and implement it and deploy it. So getting all that review cycle is most of the work, is getting the feedback and responding to it and then publishing that back out and getting more reviews. And the goal of that process is to get to a point where, where we've got a design that works well, that makes sense, that's implementable, and that solves the problems that designers want it to solve. So you can get involved in standards. Anyone can get involved in standards. You really just have to have the desire and the technical inclination to understand what's going on under the hood, and the tenacity to dig really deep into the detailed implications of all of the technical discussions that happen in the standards working groups. You can follow our progress on the working group blog. We also have our current work page lists all of the spec we're working on. It breaks them down, where are they in the process? This one's in the brainstorming phase. This one's almost done. We're on Twitter, and you can definitely send, the official way to send feedback on CSS specs is the www style mailing list, which is where all of the technical discussion happens. It's a really high traffic mailing list, but it's also really high signal to noise. It's a bit hard to follow, but that's where the work gets done. And you can also help get correct implementations, demand correctness, and write test cases. We have a testing project to write tests and collect them at W3C and get the browsers to pass those tests and have their implementations be correct. And we definitely need help. People writing test cases or explaining how to use the data that we have on which browsers pass which tests. Because it's there in a database, but it's not really very pretty. So if you have an idea of how to use it, we'd love to make it more available. And if you want to learn more about how the CSS Working Group works, I have a blog post where I kind of dig in about how do we actually operate. How are we doing on time? OK, I'm running fast. So actually, one of the things that they asked me to talk about was how I got involved in the standards. So I'll tell you a little story about that. I learned HTML in 1998. I was bored one day, and there was a book about HTML lying around the house, so I picked it up. And the introduction was funny, so I kept reading. And by chapter 3, I could make a web page. I was like, oh, great, I'll make a web page. What should I make a web page about? I didn't know. I couldn't think of a good answer, so I'll make a web page about HTML. So I just kept digging into HTML and started puttering around with some of the new features that were being implemented. This was back in the days of Netscape 4. HTML4 was a new standard. CSS2 had just been released. And I found a bug in Netscape. So I tried to report it, and I didn't think that would go anywhere. But there was an article in PC Magazine about the Mozilla project and about how Netscape had released the source code for Netscape 5 and created this open source project called Mozilla. So I went to the Mozilla.com website, got redirected to Mozilla.org, and landed on this page with like a dinosaur on it and bright, yellow and black text. And it told me that, well, here's how you can download the source and build it. If you want a binary, you can download this and test it, and here's how you report bugs. So I downloaded the binary. They'd fixed it later, as I found out, because they replaced the entire Netscape 4 layout engine with Gecko. But I kept the build around. It ran really, really slow on my Pentium 1. But it could do some cool new stuff, so I could try new things that weren't supported anywhere else. And then I found a bug in one of those cool new things, so I reported the bug. And it was kind of all downhill from there. I started doing layout triage at Mozilla, which meant that we'd get in a bug report and says, my website doesn't work in Mozilla. And I'd say, OK. So I'd look at the website, and I'd strip out all the pieces that worked fine, and then we had just the piece that didn't work. And then I'd figure out what that piece was. And then I would look at the specs and say, OK, what are we supposed to do? And then I'd write a report, and I'd say, this is what we're doing. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And here's where the specs says what we're supposed to be doing. Please fix this. And then I started running into problems where the spec didn't say what we were supposed to be doing. Or it said two completely different things depending on which section of the spec you read. And so I started reporting these problems to the W3C on their public mailing list. I'm like, well, if you read these sections and these sections, you see it doesn't say what to do in this case. And occasionally I'd give a proposal. I'd say, I suggest you define it to do this. And after several years of this, around 2004, the working group got tired of listening to my feedback and said, why don't you join the working group and help write the specs? And so I became an invited expert and participated in the meetings and started working on helping write the specs. And then 2 years later, I graduated with a degree in civil engineering. And I thought to myself, well, if I get a job as a structural engineer, which is what I wanted to do originally, I would be spending all of my daytime working on that, and then all of the nighttime, like working on CSS. And that doesn't really leave very much time left in the day. But maybe somebody will pay me to do the CSS stuff. And sure enough, HP decided to hire me to work on Mozilla. And so I became a contractor for HP for 2 years. And then when the economic downturn came, Mozilla hired me as a contractor when HP dumped me. And I just freelanced for a bit. I worked for Microsoft for a few months working on CSS 2.1 test cases. And then finally, Mozilla's HR department got really annoyed and was like, no, you need to be an employee. And so last year, after almost 12 years of not being an employee in the Mozilla project, but being in the Mozilla project, I became an employee. And so that's where I'm at right now. So yes, you too can get involved in standards. It really just takes that you really care and that you want to get involved. And that's pretty much the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? Yes?
On the media queries, how far along is that in the standards? How far along is that in the browsers?
So the question was about media queries and how far along it is. And media queries is done. It's almost a recommendation, and it's been implemented in all of the browsers. So you can use that today. Yeah, it's been implemented for a while, actually. So it's one of the most done parts of CSS3. Yes?
The last presentation in this room was about SAS.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you as an individual or representative of the organization think about these CSS abstractions.
OK. The question was about what I as an individual or as a representative of the working group think of SAS and other preprocessors like that. I think, and I think probably maybe not everyone in the working group, but quite a few do agree that what they're doing is really cool. And we support what they're trying to accomplish. There are features that they have come up with that we would like to bring into CSS, but in some cases it may or may not make sense. And so we're trying to figure out exactly like what can we bring into CSS that would really be of a benefit and what is better in a preprocessor. And I think there's a lot of the things that they do in Sass, like some of it you can't really do in CSS directly and have that be better because it requires being preprocessed to get the benefit for some of the things like performance-related things that you can do. But variables, for example, is something that we're trying to pull into CSS. The difference is that since CSS is not a preprocessor, we want to see like what can we do in CSS that's different that we can provide by having direct access to the browser engine. So you can have variables, for example, that you can manipulate via script. You can't do that in a preprocessor because it's done when it's done by the time it sends it over. So that's like, I think we all think the preprocessors are great. We want to take some inspiration from that, but you can't just like copy everything over directly. It doesn't make sense. Any other questions? All right. Okay, 20 minutes, oh my God. I thought I would run. I thought I would run over, but apparently not.
It's our fault, we're not asking that question.
Okay.
The last two presentations in this room are 20 minutes or so short each.
Okay.
So still good.
Okay. Is there anything you want me to talk about? Like, I can pull up material like just like off the top of my head. Yes.
Also related to that question we just asked,
Mhm.
is there going to be inheritance in CSS?
So the kind of inheritance that we have, that you have in the preprocessors is a little bit different from probably from what we can do in CSS. You can say like this class inherits from that class, but from CSS's perspective, a class name in HTML is just a pattern to match against. It's like selectors are kind of like a regular expression that doesn't actually define a class. So I understand this is really useful. I don't think we have a clear idea of how to have that capability in CSS in a way that actually makes sense. I don't know if that was very clear.
How about like when you define a CSS class, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever you call it.
Right. So.
And you can say how you can actually use that in simple places. Will anything like that happen?
I think there are some members of the CSS Working Group who are looking into having a way of repeating CSS content and then being able to like reuse blocks of content in other things. We don't actually have a very concrete proposal to do that. We just got a new module for variables in CSS within the past 6 months. And it's actually quite different from the way Sass and less work. The current proposal basically allows you to create arbitrary properties with some value in them, and then that will cascade and inherit it just like any other property. And then you can then reference that. That makes it pretty straightforward to manipulate it in script. It also lets you use the CSS cascading and inheritance mechanism to scope your variables in that way. So that's an example of like a way in which the preprocessor approach and the CSS approach are two completely different things because they're working in two completely different sets of constraints. And so we don't have a good answer for the kind of class inheritance problem at this point, but maybe in the future. Yes?
I'm curious about the politics involved in the working group and the various companies involved, and like how that's changed over time, and if you feel that like what the motivating forces are behind each version between technical and design and some of the politics.
Okay, that's a good question. So I wasn't in the working group in the early days, but I hear it was pretty combative. But when I joined the working group, we were kind of in the IE6 monopoly phase of the web. And at that point, Microsoft wasn't really participating very much in the CSS working group. They sent people there, but they were irrelevant people because they weren't actually working on a browser. And so the other members of the working group, from Opera and from Mozilla, were trying to do their best to work on interoperability, but within the constraints of needing to be compatible with IE6 in a lot of cases. So there was this, we were all working together and there wasn't really any political conflicts, but there was this bias towards copying IE6, where in some cases it might not have been the best option. When Microsoft started their IE7 efforts, they started sending like real members to the working group that showed up and like had input. And actually there were a number of discussions where they said, no, we don't want to do what IE6 is doing. We want to copy Firefox because that makes a lot more sense. And I would say that at least since that point, Microsoft has been a very collaborative and useful, has been contributing very usefully to the CSS Working Group. And overall, I think, I don't know if it's true in other standards groups like HTML or whatever, but in the CSS Working Group, our members have a very good relationship with each other, and we all want to make the web a better place, and we're doing our best to do that. In recent years, we've had a few conflicts. First one was over font licensing. Luckily, we were able to kick that out of our working group. It's kind of out of scope for CSS to deal with font licensing. The next set of major conflicts that are showing up now are around regions and exclusions and some other proposals where Adobe and Microsoft want to create these new capabilities and they want them faster, but they're okay with relying on JavaScript, inserting empty elements into the document in order to have them work, whereas Opera and Mozilla and some of the W3C staff members are not so happy with that approach. We're like, no, we really need to solve this in a way that is declarative, that doesn't require using scripting for the simple cases. Like even simple, like you want maybe the complicated cases you might have to use scripting, but the simple cases should be possible just in CSS, and it shouldn't require you to like insert empty elements into the DOM in order to be able to create new regions for whatever. So there's been, I think we've rehashed that same discussion like at least 3 or 4 times at every single face-to-face in the last year. But I think Adobe's starting to get the message that they need to like figure out how to solve this problem first, otherwise we're not really going to make any progress. So that's, but it's not really so much of a political issue as like different people having different opinions on what is a better approach to doing things. I guess that's more closer to political than other things. We do have a lot of strong opinions in the working group, and there will be, you know, some conflict between hey, me and the other Mozilla rep, for example, over like this particular feature. But it's mainly driven by people having different opinions on what's the best way to approach a problem, and not about like our company wants to do this type of thing. Yes.
What's the situation with respect to fonts? So like, is there any way to find out what the fonts are on the user's machine, or to pull fonts down when you need them?
So I don't think we have a way of finding out which fonts are on the user's machine, but you can use whatever's on the user's machine. But you can. We also have downloadable fonts. This was actually a feature that was in CSS 2.0 that nobody implemented, so it got pushed to CSS3, and now it's implemented. And you can, using the @fontface rule, you can specify the name of the font and then a URL to download it from, subject to appropriate licensing behavior or whatever. But within that rule, you can say, I want you to first check the user's system. If they have this font, use that. If they don't have this font, then download it from here. So yeah, you can use fonts, whatever fonts you want. There's no guarantee that they'll get downloaded, but most browsers will, if you do it correctly, will at least try. Any other questions? Yes?
This might kind of go back to the question about the political struggle in the CSS worker, but do you feel like the release, the lull and that kind of 10-year lull of like, say, pre-2000 to like, where we are now, as far as, CSS2 getting released to CSS3, is that kind of because of that kind of political, like that strain between, all these different groups trying to land on the same page?
No, I think that during CSS 2.1, there was, in fact, a lot less conflict. Because there wasn't, you can argue about design of new features where you can have more variance and of opinion. It's about, all right, we have these problems with the spec, we have to solve them. It was like a number of years of basically bug fixing the CSS spec. One thing that did make it go slower was not having Microsoft involved. Once they stepped in, things really started picking up the pace. They would bring a lot of issues to the working group that they were running into as they were rewriting their engine and say, hey, you don't say what's supposed to happen here. We want to do it right. And so let's make a decision and put that in the spec, which is probably very different from the attitude they had before. But I wasn't there before, so I can't say for sure.
So basically, it's the fault of the internet.
I think that did make things slow down a lot. But also just the mere fact that we needed to deal with the interoperability problem, and that was a lot of work. And so the CSS Working Group's efforts we were still working on CSS3 on the side, but it was on the side. Most of the effort was in fixing 2.1, and 2.1 just went to recommendation last year. So things are really starting to pick up now, and you'll start to see a lot faster progress on new features now that we don't have to, I mean, we still have to do some maintenance work, but it's not the same amount. Yes?
Are you familiar with the image set proposal?
Briefly, I think that's the one where you have several different URLs and you download one depending on the resolution.
Right.
Yeah, we're planning to add that in CSS Images Level 4. So Level 3 is going to get approved for a candidate recommendation, hopefully on Wednesday. We have to get a director's approval for that, but the CSS Working Group has already signed off on it. And once that goes to recommendation, I'm the co-editor on that module along with Tab Atkins. We're planning to draft up Level 4 and publish that and see where it goes. So yes, we're going to look into that. Yes?
Kind of related to that one, also media queries. Are there any plans or even the possibility of querying bandwidth restrictions?
That was posted to the mailing lists a couple weeks ago, and I think we got the response in the working group seemed to be, it seems like a good idea, but we don't really know exactly how to do it. How do you find out what the bandwidth is? And is it the same, and what are the different levels that people will want to query about? So I think if somebody came together with like a more concrete proposal on exactly how you were expected to implement something like that, we'd take it up. But right now, it's not entirely clear how that's supposed to work.
What about processor speed of the machine rendering it?
That's probably a similar issue, where it's like, one of the guys from Opera pointed out, like, you can have 3G connection that's slow, or you can have one that's fast. You can have, Wi-Fi and 3G enabled at the same time. There's also the issue of like dial-up access is slow, but like cable access is faster, or maybe you have a high latency connection, but it's really fast, like satellite, for example. It takes a while for something to kick in and start downloading, but once it does, it's really fast. So it would be nice to have them, but we don't really know exactly how to do that. And nobody has come up with a concrete enough proposal for us to actually put it in a spec. Any other questions? Cool. Well, if you have anything you want to ask me or anything you want to talk about, let me know. I'm here until 5 o'clock at least. All right.